Благодарю вас. Добрый вечер. Очень приятно вас здесь видеть.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to see you here. I would like to let you know that this series of lectures basically is going to combine different points of view, biographical, personal experience, and artistic perspective. So this lecture is not going to be an exception. I'm going to speak both about subjective ideas of one of possible views on the city that I share, and different research findings that have been received as part of joint program and as part of joint research work. When I say subjective, it doesn't mean that it's a random point of view. I just mean that there are many completely different viewpoints, I just offer you one of those sociological viewpoints that is quite new, unlike in contrast to positivist perspective and the way they describe the city. So, speaking about sociological specifics, what is it like? What does a sociologist do when he or she looks at the city? If you have never studied sociology, sociology is the science about the invisible. Sociologist studies the structures that cannot be visible in direct interaction, and they are not necessarily obvious. So the biggest dilemma is how to make the invisible visible for the sociologist. Of course, you can show tables, diagrams that will reveal different kind of orders that are not obvious for a viewer. You can work with different maps. You can go in deeper into the lives of the classes that are not presented publicly. So both sociology and anthropology use a very diverse toolbox. So I suggest that we start with this presentation of the invisible that is closely related to the idea of traditional kind, but it requires attention to detail. So let's take a look on the Moscow from the bird flight point. So what are we going to see if we just take a look at the geographic map of Moscow? It's obvious that this is a beautiful aesthetic object, but it can't give you a lot speaking about differences, about functions and mechanisms the city works with. When we look at the city as a plane, we can speak about circularity principle used in Moscow. But sociologists are more interested in how the residents use this space and how this space use the residents. So, for example, if we want to try to give an answer how space uses the citizens, we'll use several instruments that are not necessarily sociological, but they will be relevant for sociology. So when I was working with archaeology of Moscow space, I mean archaeology in the nearest, in the recent decades, I can tell you that 2011, 2013 were the most fruitful and productive for sociologists, because it was during that time when many journalists and experts were concerned with what Moscow was like from the spatial differences point of view. So I want to show you several maps that can help you see certain things that are not visible at the first glance. So this is one of the first ecological maps of Moscow. So you can see areas marked in dark that are problematic areas, and it means that Moscow loses its neutrality. So from this circular structure, it turns into a more complicated shape that can already help us to identify certain problems and inequality. It means that there's different access to environment, and the quality of environment is different in different areas. So we have had several maps like that. This is the first map. Then the next map is showing how polluted the air in Moscow. And this longer area, now the most problematic areas are marked by red and bright red. This is the general map of pollution that was created in 2011 and 2013. And so this is one of the explanations as to why the injustice is objectified this way. So this is the map of industrial zones in Moscow that used to exist here, and the ecological inequality is similar to the distribution of industrial zones in the city space. So this is one of the factors that determine what the space does with our bodies, with ourselves, with our willingness to go and live in certain districts, and our perception of what happens in different districts. Of course, this kind of knowledge can never be neutral, and it was quite evident that this kind of knowledge about social inequality disturbed both the city government and developers, and after 2013 you will never be able to find such maps. Whether it was a direct ban or just lower interest from mass media to objectify the invisible in the form of inequality, I do not know. But so you can see even bigger contrasts here. Here, marked in blue, are good districts in environmental sense. So you can see the western area, southwest area, and average zones of pollution that just have lots of cars. So what other factors or variables can help us to see this inequality? Let's take a look at other maps. So this is an attempt to make a map of crime in Moscow. Of course, we can't trust it entirely just due to statistics and due to the process of working with data, but you can see that the axis of crimes for 2013 reported by police is similar to the pollution areas. So I don't know how accurate this map is, but anyway, it was a worth attempt to make. This is another map created by the newspaper Moscow News, and they worked with official police statistics, and we can see the same focus. And it can let us make a conclusion that there are certain layers that overlap. This is a Yandex map that demonstrates the prices of accommodation given for rent in 2013. So dark green shows the cheapest kind of accommodation. I know that it would be indecent to say cheap about Moscow accommodation, but anyway, these prices would be very different from those areas marked by yellow or red. So we can see there are areas that have a quite good environmental situation and less crime. And this is another map that is directly related to the previous ones. This is a map of the fifth-story buildings before the renovation program started. This was made in 2015 based on official data from Mayor's office, so you can see that the most movements, the most redevelopment areas are located in the different areas that you could expect. For example, in northern east area, those five-story buildings are not going to be demolished. It's difficult to say whether this can represent the frustrating history of changing the settlement structure related to five-story buildings. But we can discover that the residents living in Mitino or Strogino districts complain about playgrounds, that too many playgrounds get renovated too often. If you go to Kantemirovskaya district, you will see that children's playground look the same as those in the late Soviet time. So renovating playgrounds is characteristic of only certain districts, because we can see something opposite to that in some other areas that are not considered to be attractive for investments, and you can't really see any positive dynamics in those districts that could be compared with other areas. And finally, the map that shows us the renovation plan for Moscow. These are the buildings that take part in the voting, where residents can vote whether they want to move to a different building or not. And you can see that there is a limited number of buildings that are going to be redeveloped. And in the other districts, we can see much more buildings and more consolidated interest on part of developers that want to invest in the development of those districts. So what do these maps tell us about? This is not some strict knowledge. It's not directly related to statistics or mathematical analysis. I can just tell you that just like sociological work, they are aimed at making visible something which is invisible, something that the city hides from us. And Moscow or any other big city not necessarily notice those details. Of course, maps are not the only tool that we can work with when we speak about the invisible. So going down to the ground, we can actually go under the ground. This is the map of Paris metro. And Paris is a quite centralized city, just like Moscow. And why I draw this comparison between the map of Paris and Moscow? Because it can let you draw very interesting conclusions. I'm not going to elaborate on this map, but I can just tell you that this blue line going on the top is one of the few that connects prestigious districts with the poor districts. And Pierre Bourdieu considered this line to be revolutionary, because a person from a poor district could take a metro and go to the rich district. Of course, not many people did that. Not many wanted to go to the opposite pole. But if we take a look at other central lines that connect different points of Paris. For example, number 10 that starts in the 16th district, and it looks like it goes to the east, which is less prestigious. But we can see that this movement to the east goes through the central points. So it means that there are some erroneous ideas of city transport. And analyzing metro, just like analyzing the public, seems to be very interesting for sociologists. For example, if you take the same trips on the same line and make changes at the same place, you can see the shifts as to how people behave on the train, how they are dressed, and they might not be so obvious, but maybe the people using the Moscow metro reflect the social inequalities that we have observed on the ecological maps and accommodation pricing maps. So sociologists can use a lot of material to study the inequality. Now, having been in the sky and underground, we can go on the ground. Sociologists usually do their work on the ground. So I suggest that we go deeper into the everyday life that people have. In order to begin the conversation as to what life in Moscow is like and how it reflects the state we're in. So let's start with the question, what Moscow residents consider theirs. Can you hear it? There are few buildings left like that in the center. What do you think? Where does this dialogue take place? Where can it be in Moscow? Somewhere beyond the center, or on the edge of the center. So does everybody have such places that you can visit from time to time? You can see there, you can sit there, and again, it's one of the few places left in Moscow. I think it's a great illustration showing how Moscow can be seen. So it can be quite cozy, quite comfortable, and elegantly run down. That is really connected with ultra-modernity. But how can you get to those places? So here we come closer to this principal dimension of Moscow life, because we sometimes forget about it when we try to get the access to what we own. So we have to go there because it's a really interesting place. How can we get in? There's a lock. No, we won't be able to get in there. It's locked. It looks like it's open there. We should get in there. So, how can you get to the place that you want to go to? How can you get to the place that you think it's yours? It's obvious that this place doesn't really belong to this person. And is not privately owned. So I'm going to make a pause here. I actually edited this video. You know, I wanted to show this person that faces the closed doors. So I just wanted to make a point that we live in a fortress, carefully protected fortress. For example, how many doors do you lock before you want to go somewhere, before you want to go here to garage? For example, I've counted how many doors I have to lock, and I want just to compare my numbers with yours. Only 3? So when you leave your place where you live, or when you come back to the place you live, when you go back home, how many? 4? I have counted 7 doors. For example, if you come to the building where you live, it could be a gate, to the courtyard. Then the next one, the door to the entrance of your section. Then there'll be probably 2 metal doors. If you want to go to the section of your floor, then there'll be the 5th door, the new door to go to your apartment, and then the older door remained from the Soviet times. It's a funny thing, you know. Why do you have to keep that old door? For noise insulation, but it was really interesting. Why do people keep the old doors, even though if you have metal door. So if we add more doors when that we have to go through trying to get into some institution, we understand that we have a limited trajectory. So this aspect of impenetrable space makes Moscow different from other cities that went through post-socialist transformation. So where do we really want to get? We used to have sculptors' studios there. We would climb up there, we would climb to the ceiling, to the roof, because it was very interesting for us how sculptors were working. We were really curious about their work. So this Moscovite that accompanied us showed the places that he knew from childhood. Of course, it's not his property, and maybe you wonder what he's doing there. He is no longer a child. Why does he claim to this space? Why does he want to get through these fences? Maybe there's no need for him to be there, and it means that we have a certain attitude to this. It's not that I'm trying to have a dispute whether we want it or not, whether we need to be there or not. It's just the space gives us a certain logic, the idea of iron door. So let's see what happens next with this penetration to somebody else's area. It's locked. Those sections, this goes like this and the other one like that, and this is this building called a saw building, seesaw building. So it looks like a seesaw, but I don't really know how we can see the entire corridor, because the kitchens remain the same. And looking at the frying pan, somebody's cooking. Actually, they can throw us from here easily. So, do you think it was legal or illegal penetration to the building? Illegal. Why? So it only confirms what I have mentioned. Yes, we had to climb over the fence. So it's a good discussion, because it's inevitable if we speak about the structure of Moscow space. Actually, this is a commune house, commune building, so it was designed to be open. That's why it's very interesting for architects, because this is a constructivist monument. So there's a collision. This building is out of date because it doesn't comply with today's reality of iron doors, and it has a special status that we have to deal with. So this invisible city of Moscow that we can find right in the center, because this is Luzhniki, so it's not far from the Kremlin, from the Moscow River. So it demonstrates that the city is much more complicated than we think. So if we ask a question who the space of the city belongs to, maybe we should go beyond this discussion whether this was legal or illegal, because it's natural for people to take interest in their cities. So we are in the central district of Moscow, but it feels like we are somewhere else, not even in the countryside, not even in the Moscow region. I think it was a good example. So now let's take another example. I showed you the map of Paris, and now I'm going to show you some photos from Paris. What do you think people do in these pictures? How can people eat surrounded by these dump sites, by waste bins? How can they enjoy this? How can they tolerate this? Just look, there are these posters on the ground, some strange place, and just the tables and chairs for cafe visitors nearby. And this is not not a very rich area. And you can actually see many people just sitting in Paris or in Rome, just on the sidewalk. And what do they do? And why can you do the same? Do you do the same in Moscow? How often do you do it in Moscow? And where do you do it also? Where do you sit on a sidewalk? On the periphery. Where exactly? Can you just sit on this on the road? Yes, but I think it's very rare, because it's not often that you can find this thing in Moscow. You will probably sit on a bench, and there are certain signs that are taken as an indicator of marginality, even though we have a space for pleasure, for bodily or corporal pleasure, but still it would be difficult to imagine such cafe in, let's say, Kapotnya district. So I wanted to introduce here the second subject. So the iron door is a symbol of safety and closeness. And we sometimes ignore things when we go to Europe. A sign of prestigious, permissible thing. So will liberalization be the only response to this if we contrast bodily practices and social practices? I think that European city is interesting for comparison, not because it's liberal. You can actually find overregulation there as well, and it'll make you understand that a European city won't give you a chance to do what you want, have this laissez-faire attitude. So we have lost this special state of vulnerability, because a European city implies that the joint life of residents is based on our vulnerability when we open up to each other and show that we are vulnerable. and fragile, and we can enjoy this, and we are not afraid of being judged or condemned, or we're not afraid of aggression. We're not afraid that we'll be kicked out or we will be beaten up. So this is a very important thing for today's discussion. If we speak not about liberal thing, but about vulnerability and how we can manage it so that we could make our life easier and more erotic, in a sense, Franco Berardi speaks about it. It's not about the attraction between the bodies or something which always imply sexuality. It's just the pleasure from talking to each other, and it means that we have to be weak or vulnerable to be interesting for each other. So our life behind 3 or even more iron doors does not really help us to show that we are vulnerable, and we can't really see the space that can be used. And I think it's very important to discuss this, how the openness of space and safety are related to other things, not only from technological point of view, like surveillance cameras, police, etc. It's just we do not notice how we try to build fences from others. Trying to become safe, we lose the collective life, the joint life together. And speaking about vulnerability, we have to mention different forms of joint life. And first of all, this is related to disabilities and disabled people. Maybe you heard how much different Moscow infrastructure, how much infrastructure has been criticized. And once you begin to discuss the life of disabled people, you will discover unbelievable variables related to accessibility, because the concept of accessibility means that people with disabilities can become more independent, because that's the meaning of accessibility. So let's take a look as to how this principle is realized. Thanks to one of the people with a disability. She uses the wheelchair, and she is very attentive to certain mechanisms of how the accessibility works. So I just wanted to clarify, this is an elevator that can take you to the top of the bridge. So the person that uses the wheelchair shouldn't have any troubles, because this person has just to press the button. So you understand what happens, right? So the this person comes to the elevator, presses the button, but the door of the elevator won't open. It means that there's a dispatcher sitting somewhere that takes a phone call and promises that this he or she will come 7 minutes later. So the principle of autonomy is compromised here. So they just told me that I can press the button to let them know. See how many buttons there are and how many instructions here. And there's also a camera, and the camera is a very important element of launching this process. So a person can make a phone call or press the button, but it's not just enough, you know. The person can't just say, oh, I need this elevator. There are cameras that confirm that there are no violations. So it's a super system of accessibility. So we speak about home accessibility, some platforms that can be built following the request of people with disabilities. So I have a platform that is working in my building, so I can use it. And there are cameras installed there, and you can call a dispatcher in order to come up. And in the past I had to wait for hours if I came at night, but now I have a key, so I can open it and go myself. So you can make an agreement with them. So thanks to this exclusive experience, the experience of minority that are more attentive to certain aspects of the city functioning, we can see how the major principles of city life have been implemented. Because just due to our habit, we sometimes seem to be short-sighted and do not know many things. We ignore many things without noticing them. So we can ask, what is Moscow like? How accessible is the city space? How safe is it? So we begin to observe some infra details that reveal real and not so obvious mechanics of Moscow. The notion of vulnerability that actually, and this opportunity to see the invisible has been studied by Judith Butler. And she used this concept to describe LGBT community experience and how this vulnerability, when you are a part of LGBT, turns into an action. So I have to refer to the social practice. She describes anti-AIDS community and LGBT community life, when these communities turn the stigma into a social practice and turning themselves into a political subject. And so turning the vulnerability not into something opposite, not trying to oust your own vulnerability, but an attempt to turn this vulnerability into an individual subject or topic for interaction. So since I have mentioned Judith Butler, it would be useful to refer to LGBT activists' experience that are productively involved in creating a space of possible social vulnerability, which can be found in Moscow life. Is it possible to walk holding hands and is it possible to kiss in public? Well, I can do it easily anywhere and always, but my girlfriend doesn't like it. Of course, it's very difficult. But still, I feel at home here. I think we shouldn't hide anything. And I never really think about negative people and about their negative response to what I do, even though I was thrown stones at on the 1st of June. Also, the bottle has been thrown once at me and an egg. But I can't say that I felt a lot of aggression in Moscow. Are there any places in Moscow where you feel safe? I feel quite safe. If I don't take part in some activist actions, I feel fine. So this is a great illustration that shows you the twinkling of Moscow space. So if you are an activist, if you are an LGBT person, it means that you are in danger. But if LGBT becomes part of the common, of our joint life in Moscow, it becomes quite normal and natural. Maybe the norm is not a word that I should use when we speak about Moscow life, because we just use it way too much. This is normal and this is not normal. It's normal to feel or let something happen. So anyway, this is something that takes us beyond the norm. And if there is this joint space for pleasure, it means that this experience of vulnerability has to fit there. So I think this view, which is quite diverse, including the experience of fight, and act as if the Moscow city never sanctioned vulnerability. All this helps us understand how we feel ourselves in terms of safety and vulnerability. And then we have this fundamental question. So what are the conditions for this joint existence? Do we have a common space for Moscow? Somebody might say yes, and the person will be right. Even speaking about Gorky Park, it's a space for sanctioned pleasure. So you can sit on the asphalt, on the sidewalk, wherever you want. But still, when we speak about the common space in a simple terms, in a narrow sense, which can be subject for political philosophy, and also the space of political or social debates as to how the contemporary society should be like. So we think about the life that we can afford, and without any sanctions. For example, when the gates of some institutions close. So it means we have to take a closer look at the experience of city activists that were fighting for this urban space. Not many people were interested in this because it was considered that they were dealing with some mundane issues. But from the sociologist point of view, city activism aimed at protecting green zones or children's playground, or the windows and the view from the window, and to prevent the construction of a new building. All this are part of a bigger social theory and works related to interaction in the space. So let's ask a city activist whether Moscow has a common space, whether this collectivization of vulnerability could be possible. These public spaces that used to be in every big building included public libraries, something called red corner space, but all this is gone because when the building council is established, they don't have a space, so there aren't any accessible public spaces in this residential apartment buildings. So if they say the residents don't want to get involved into some joint activities. The courtyard is not exactly serving this person, and there is no other space. So we can draw a very important conclusion from this. Again, we rarely think about it just being city consumers. It's good if you can come to the park, sit in a cafe, because these are all permissible or allowed pleasures. But what if we want to do something which is not allowed? For example, get to that constructivist building, or if we want to discuss some issues related to our living, where can we do it? And again, we are limited here with our apartment space behind the iron door, and very rarely we communicate with the neighbors. So neighborhood turns into a problematic category, and for example, if I ask you who is active in some house, in some activities delivered by groups that share the same building, I guess the geography of the place we live seems quite gray and dark, with maybe just some green roads that we can walk along. So if we want to be with citizens that want to take care of their buildings. And I guess this deputy, municipal council deputy, gives a very accurate answer. And again, we live in a constant state of stress and frustration without noticing it. It's clear that every district has its own group on Facebook. You can discuss all sorts of things related to your district. This is clear. But as to the physical reality, they never cross. And I think this is an exact description. You know, your district life on the Facebook is a good metaphor as to how we want to use our district and our neighborhood to make sure we're not disturbed. Does something happen in the space, let's say on a boulevard or some other areas? When something happens, we have some events. I don't know, it could be a meeting to protect the shop, or to protect the place where you can walk the dogs. So people do talk with each other and discuss some local events. We have a district organization for residents, and we have records of all the leaders living in 150 buildings that belong to this district. So the chair of the building, or the chair of some group, or the head of housing council. We have this data, we have this database. So when we have some requirements, we just have a meeting where all those people participate. So it means that only when there is a threat we have this common space, not from the desire to share something, not from the desire to have a joint pleasure. We turn into a close-knit neighborhood only when there is a threat. And so this actualization happens when we are on the brink of extinction. Only then this logic of common space becomes relevant. Only then we begin to notice each other, to talk to each other, and that's a very important condition of our joint life as adults. And it fits in the context of safety, vulnerability, or normality that we're trying to achieve here in Moscow. I see that you are not very enthusiastic about these observations. Because it's difficult to talk about ourselves as non-vulnerable people and social creatures. So when is the space for common pleasure possible? Maybe if not for adults, it's available for teenagers. Maybe if we are when we are in a state of vulnerability and enjoyable danger that makes us interesting to play, maybe that's when we begin to exist as people living together. So I tend to give a positive answer to this question after the interview that we had with the participants of immature, vulnerable people that are much better than adults. But before I share it with you, it's obvious that socialization between teenagers is not without problems. It's not only institutionalization of pleasure. So all those interviews that we had both with adults that shared the experience about teenagers' life and the interviews with teenagers testify that. So getting back to the closed doors, this experience of safety and security that we want so much as long as we become older has its own history. If we look at the projects in the late 50s, the first development projects of those 5-story buildings that are about to be demolished very soon. The architects planned to build swimming pools for children. So now think about today's Moscow. Can a designer plan a swimming pool for children? Whereas in the first design projects for those Khrushchev kind of buildings had space for swimming pools, and it was not because the Soviet leaders were so wise. It was just because there was such a big gap between Khrushchev era and Stalin's period. So that's why people wanted to make this city completely different from what it used to be. And they wanted to let children not just sneak into the swimming pool, but understanding how much children wanted to use the swimming pool. They envisaged this facility, but that period finished quite soon. And in the 60s, all those excessive features were taken away. And then we all had the experience that can explain why we want to be closed from each other. So this experience of dangerous common space is something I want to show you now. My parents closed from the external world in the 90s. They put these huge doors with big keys. Those keys looked like a microchip. It was such a big key. So, it looked like you opened the door to some hidden storage of orcs. So, my parents really wanted to isolate themselves. And in fact, my mother was a very active Soviet citizen. She really believed in that. But in the 90s, when I was born and she was 27, so my parents closed, and so they wanted me to be there. They always helped me with homework. They discussed all sorts of problems with me. But I felt that there was wildlife outside of my window, because I could hear gunshots, and my mother was trying to hide me. Who is familiar with this kind of experience? No one? I guess it makes us feel ashamed. I'm very grateful to this guy that shares this experience because, it's true that those attempts to protect ourselves was behind the iron doors. So then he explained how this developed, and the public institutions that were aimed at fostering an open subject began to put fences around them. We, for example, crossed the threshold of the school, and it was crazy. I remember that these heavy boots were fashionable, so one of the guys used those heavy boots to hit a person on the head, and the teachers couldn't do anything. They would just close their eyes to that. For example, let's say we had chemistry, so the teacher would tell you some facts, whereas when you went out, you could hear gunshots. It's true that the teenagers' experience is not only related to the experience of violence stemmed from the adults' world. It's also about the violence between the peers, and violence plays a completely different function here. So the sociologists can study the city as a space of violence, penetrating into the world of different people. We can begin to see that Moscow is closely related with violence, and it continues to reproduce violence. And every green part that you want to have is a big thing. You have to fight for that. So still, there are some unorthodox forms of using the city space. The city, the nice city planned as this city of consumption, prescribes us to oust violence because we are the subjects with growing consumption power. So violence is recoded, is driven out thanks to the shopping malls that emerge, or thanks to the cafes that open. And our interviewee mentioned this. When the McDonald's was open, it was a revolution. So those people that don't live in that northern eastern district, we probably think that most of the spaces are colonized by trading points and commercialization, because all those places, all those trading sites opened only 13 years ago. So again, getting back to the point, who does this space belong to? It belongs to the teenagers, because the teenagers use commercial structures, but also abundant libraries or schools as their own space. And thanks to that, we have our own city when we are teenagers. But as we move along our professional career ladder, we remove ourselves from the space. But while we still living there, so many things happen there. So the experience of violence overlaps with the experience of pleasure. I used to talk. I used to stay or hang out with one company, then to another company. So at one point, I realized that everybody knew me. So, what does she talk about? She talks about the rooftop of the shopping mall. That roof is designed for the parking, but it became a special place for teenagers when they are not disturbed by any external effects and regulation. But when they become adults, and we lose this opportunity. They lose this opportunity, and we become more sensitive to unheard orders of architecture. I use the term of Bourdieu. So, in order to enjoy the city, we have to go to Gorky Park or some other place, and our experience is no longer related to the free space that we used as teenagers. So you can move from the rooftop to the theater, like the whole company. How many people would that be? About 10 people. Do you have some gay people? Yes, Emma, a girl, and a couple of gay guys. So you never rejected them? No, we have a girl who is a lesbian, and so she spoke about it openly. It's a really interesting district. She also mentions football fans using the word ofnik. So it's a non-trivial constellation of things, the environment, the company that has this macho pole accustomed to violence, and her friend told us that they often had fights and different kinds of non-peaceful coexistence between different groups of football fans. So, but still, this company is using the space in a non-trivial way, and they still can develop the forms of interaction and being open to vulnerability that we adults lack. We have some a strange idea about teenagers' life, but you know, the teenagers turn out to be much more advanced, unlike adults. After the school, after 3 p.m., everybody goes there. You don't even have to call, you know, because you know that everybody goes there. There's no other place to go. people know each other's codes to enter their section of the building, and everybody knows each other. And I actually wanted to come back to Черемушки district because I wanted to hang out with the company, to walk with them. I really love Черемушки. Who can tell you, who can tell the same, who can say that, oh, I love my district so much, I will never leave it. Maybe if you have a forest or a park or a lake next to your place, you can say this, but it's different with teenagers, because teenagers' experience shows that they use the city together, and they develop borders between different groups, even though they are very open and show their vulnerability. And this girl mentioned that. And the same is true about violence. Violence is normalized in teenagers' environment, because fighting is normal both for girls and boys, which is again opposite to the adults' work, to adults' life. So if we continue working with invisible spaces of the city, when we speak about violence, we speak about different kinds of violence, because there's inversion of violence and pleasure. Danger can be attractive when you feel that you are doing some common cause. And when we become adults, it becomes different. Adults prefer to go to get a cup of coffee in a cafe or in a park rather than on the roof of the building. But still, teenagers are very open to the city. They own their district, and I think that's a very important achievement that we are losing when we enter the university and begin work. So there are so many things we can learn from teenagers. And our interviewees mentioned LGBT groups and other people, and they say, I don't consider myself an adult. I can still learn something from children, from teenagers, from young people. I don't consider myself to be too serious, and that's what makes possible a critical view of the city space. You shouldn't be concerned with your security. Since I began to talk about football, I wanted to show you another evidence. All kind of service-based sociology and urban studies are aimed at reproducing city models that could be safe, that could facilitate consumption and create a nice city, friendly city. But this friendly doesn't mean joint initiatives coming from the bottom. So the city cannot be transformed into a nice and friendly city without ousting social groups beyond the boundary of continuity. So the program of renovation and resettlement is a next step to city segregation, when more and more areas become nice, when less educated, less socially connected people would have to leave those districts, just like it happened in the 90s in the central area of Moscow. And it makes us think how we could make possible, we could make coexistence possible. And I mean LGBT experience, which is not related to cultural denial, and the participants of a violence group, can they be included in the city space? So these questions have to be resolved in the terms of vulnerability. Those people that practice violence, that use it for certain purposes, for example, anti-fascism, it's again part of our culture. If anti-fascists didn't come out to the streets in the 2000s, they began to drive out fascists, our existence today would be much more problematic. So after that historical cycle was over, and the journalists persuaded themselves that fascists and anti-fascists were the same, whatever we can find in the history of the years 2000s, it all testifies to the opposite, because people that chose to fight out in the streets, they wanted to do it to protect the city, to make it safer. And I wanted to share the experience of this city rascal. And he explains that violence can turn into a pedagogical method of development, and can help you to maintain the openness of the city. I served in the army, and afterwards I came home. So it all happened naturally. I actually wasn't aggressive at all. And I can actually tell you why I became like that. My friend invited me to attend a concert. And there was some fire, so then the fight started. So people beat up each other. Somebody tried to escape and go on the stage. Then they began to break chairs, and then the police came. And we were taken to a railway station. And after I got off the train, I saw that my shoes were covered in blood. We should fight against hatred using different methods, propaganda or explanation. I could fight really well. Now I'm married, I have 2 children. The older child is 5-year-old, and he's creative. He doesn't like violence. So that's a very important example of vulnerability. When people deliberately take up violence to change the city situation, especially when the state or police can't help, they take their functions upon themselves, being very young. So, again, how can we exist in the city when some people can take up the function of violence, realizing that our vulnerability does not necessarily have to be fragile, it can be a powerful force. So I should probably finish my lecture here and say that sociology that reveals the invisible is far from optimistic, nice picture that can be given by urban or architectural projects that speak about desired future and not the reality. But since the sociologist is looking into the windows, the sociologist gets access to such dimensions of social life that help us problematize this experience and move on further. I don't have much time, as far as I understand, but I hope that we still have 5 or 7 minutes for the discussion. I would love to thank all the participants of this research that agreed to share their experience about Moscow. I have shown you only tiny pieces from that material, and I'd love to thank the members of the research group that were working hard trying to reveal the hidden, the invisible. So thank you. My name's Konstantin Ivanov. I'm a historian. It's very interesting, thank you. I was growing up in a different city. I wonder whether this model can be applied to other places. Or is this true only about big cities? For example, I was growing up in a small provincial town, and actually, I can say that people try to isolate themselves too, and the place that teenagers liked was the place that the adults hated. Maybe they use different kind of different materials for the doors. But anyway, I also wanted to ask you about the teenagers' behavior. Can it be about building fences? Thank you. They are very important questions that have been widely discussed. There's no one single answer. Teenagers' conformism is as powerful as openness and vulnerability that help you explore the city in a non-trivial way. Of course, a lot of things are determined by family capital, the cultural capital, and other kind of capital. For example, it's important to see what family the teenager belongs to and how he or she perceives the experience of violence, because people that belong to more educated circles see violence as some individual examples, whereas people that belong to poorer social strata, they perceive violence in a more systematic way. And in big cities, you have more opportunities for coexistence with others, and maybe that's why there is a bigger variety of forms as compared to smaller towns. If you want to have a deeper answer, it's important to conduct research.
Скажем так, социологической логике в репрезентативности нужно, конечно, проводить отдельные исследования.
I have a question about the instruments that you use for sociological research. How do you work? What kind of results do you have? And what about things I have shown you? Does it not look like sociological work? Or maybe you have some different forms of work? Well, interview is just one of the forms of sociological work. And actually, video interview is not practiced widely by sociologists. It's just an experiment, biographical and disciplinary. Some sociologists actually work in this register. When you want to record a narration, an interview. But I can tell you that this technique I used is not quite successful because the image was quite poor. And in fact, sometimes your interviewees cannot say for the camera something that they can say if you record them with a dictaphone. I actually wonder about your video experiment. That person telling about gunshots, about heavy grinders boots. How honest are they? Well, this research had a pilot character, and this research is still underway. I guess sociologists try to avoid this kind of representation, a very high level of self-reflection. This is what's important. And it means that these interviewees have not just to share their experience, but also relate it with the context, with other people's behavior. So this has been a pilot research, so we try to find the people that could reflect upon their experience. And if we speak about artistic reflection, Boris Klyushnikov is the historian of arts, and he works with his experience of violence, and he works with this experience as a researcher from artistic perspective. Yes, there is a certain degree of performance there, but I'm sure many changes that he mentioned in his interviews were relevant to the experience of other teenagers.